Most contemporary dictionaries define corruption as dishonest or fraudulent conduct by those in power, typically involving bribery. However, corruption can more precisely be defined as a system structure. System structures are made up of people who engage in thought, speech, and/or action towards a shared goal. For every process, there are prescribed methods for completing such a process. Any deviation of those prescribed methods in order to harm your perceived enemies or to favor yourself at that moment, one is said to be engaging in corruption. Corruption isn't limited to developing nations. Many developed nations are in their own ways dealing with corruption. Many critics have faulted Transparency International's Global Corruption Index for consistently portraying developing nations as extremely corrupt, while on the other hand portraying developed nations as paragons of incorruptible virtue. Critics point out that Transparency International's index uses a very narrow definition of corruption. Thus, common practices in developed nations that could be labeled as corrupt are excluded, while common practices in developing nations are overemphasized. Such overlooked common practices in developed nations include Western financial institutions acting as safe havens for looted funds from developing nations that need these funds for their very survival. Although such a practice is rampant, very little media attention is devoted to exposing these financial transactions. Nor has there been any consistent effort by the political elite in the West to penalize organizations that corruptly harbor these stolen funds. When it comes to Africa, it is not uncommon for Western media to depict the stereotypical trope of the poverty-stricken African. But these same media houses fail to show the involvement of Western financial institutions in aiding corrupt leaders who propagate such poverty. When it comes to corruption, widely entrenched or narrowly focused, corruption can bring about the total collapse of a nation. Such a collapse can be witnessed by the overnight disintegration of the Afghan government. On this episode of Up Close and Center, we will discuss corruption, the long-term effects of how systematic corruption disabled and destroyed Afghanistan, and what African nations can learn from this. My name's Ebube Okoli. Welcome to Up Close and Center. Please remember to like, share, subscribe, and hit that bell notification icon so that you'll be among the first to know every time new content becomes available. Additionally, if you have any further analysis on the topic, please feel free to use the comment section. After 20 years and more than $80 billion in support from the international community, Afghanistan's military was still unsuccessful in preventing a rapid takeover by the Taliban. There were more than 300,000 members of the Afghan security forces reported, but the real number may have been as little as half of that number, as the official numbers were undoubtedly inflated due to long-standing corruption. Figures on the size of Afghanistan's forces were consistently marred by the problem of so-called ghost fighters. Ghost fighters are imaginary soldiers and police officers who were listed on the employee rolls only so corrupt elites could collect their salaries. Essentially, much-needed military personnel and hardware simply didn't exist outside of the billing paper used to secure government funding. This practice was taking place at the same time the nation was facing the looming threat of a full-scale insurgency from the very real fighters of the Taliban. The nation's ghost fighters weren't the only issue with the nation's fighting figure of 300,000 personnel. Extremely high turnover in the Afghan armed forces meant that at any given time, many of the nation's military and police positions were either vacant but filled on paper, or the positions were actually filled by legitimate employees. However, even with these legitimate hires, many of them simply weren't battle ready, but used the position as a way to collect salary without having the true qualifications or even equipment necessary to wage war. As the United States gradually withdrew its armed forces from Afghanistan, the job of running the country, including the security apparatus, fell within the exclusive ambit of the Afghan government. However, as this transition was happening, Afghanistan's elites chose to ignore the vast corruption happening in the armed forces. Instead, the political elite merely focused on acquiring power and money for themselves and their cliques. Systematic corruption meant that key jobs and promotions went to the politically connected, or to those who paid bribes for the positions, rather than those most willing, competent, motivated, or even able to fight. As the US began to pull out, the Taliban began advancing, reportedly offering amnesty, food, and even money for poorly fed security forces, some of whom hadn't been paid their salary in months. The Taliban offered these in exchange only if the Afghan fighters agreed to simply lay down their weapons and go home. And, allegedly, a great many of them actually did. Corruption in Afghanistan is still a widespread and growing problem. Out of 180 nations ranked by Transparency International's 2021 Corruption Perception Index, Afghanistan ranked 6 places from the bottom, coming in at 174th place out of 180 countries. Corruption wasn't just limited to the armed forces. In Afghanistan, the weak judiciary often bent before the will of the powerful, the connected, and the elites, who predictably took advantage of their political connections and positions in society. Others, typically the masses and the less fortunate, were unable to use such advantages. As such, many of them had to pay bribes or suffer from the frustration due to the intentionally lengthy processes. As a result, a vast majority of the Afghan population made use of an informal justice system, and some even turned to the Taliban for assistance. The compounding effects of these actions weakened the Afghan government's legitimacy. Troops face battle knowing that they may not be fed or paid because money and resources meant for battle were allegedly being siphoned out by corrupt leaders. Many fighters believed that if they were killed, their widows would probably not receive their pensions without bribes or connections, therein leaving their families destitute. If they were wounded, they had to bribe medical staff for care and then pay for the food and medical supplies out of their own pockets that hadn't been properly paid in several months, as many salaries were simply diverted. A recent report stated that at least 40% of the thousands of defense contracts totaling tens of billions of dollars ended up in the hands of corrupt syndicates and corrupt officials. Accordingly, the Taliban merely capitalized on that reality, finding any armed opposition seemingly unwilling to carry on fighting on behalf of a government that they themselves viewed as woefully corrupted. The Taliban's path to conquest was made easier by the fact that a significant percentage of Afghan defense forces existed only on paper, allegedly, all in order to keep the finances flowing to crooked military commanders and their political backers. Thus, Afghan armed forces largely existed only on paper, and as predicted, these ghost soldiers were very little resistance to the real fighters from the Taliban. So, what can African nations learn from the example of how corruption dismantled Afghanistan? Corruption in Africa is a major impediment to the development of African security forces. Systematic corruption in the military and police services is already highly entrenched. Like in Western Asia, terrorist activities have grown in their scope and complexities during the last 2 decades. Such groups currently operating include the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, roaming bandits, and various other smaller groups. Countries dealing with a new wave of extremist violence include Mali, Niger, Mauritania, Algeria, Libya, Egypt, Nigeria, Chad, Burkina Faso, Kenya, Sudan, Somalia, Tanzania, and Ethiopia. As much as these terrorist groups thrive on government weakness, military corruption also plays a large and important role in the growth of such groups in Africa. Transparency International recently gave every African nation surveyed a failing or near failing grade when it comes to preventing systematic corruption in their defense sectors. Although defense spending is on the rise across Africa, without proper systems used for tracking how that money is spent, there is very little to ensure that it will go to areas that it is needed most, namely counterterrorism and security programs. With the current limited oversight on military spending, there are still many avenues for systematic corruption that in turn contributes to the rising insecurity on the continent. The end results are military losses, civilian losses, more insecurity, and overall less development for a continent striving to catch up with the rest of the world after having its organic development disrupted by colonialism. So we again ask, what lessons can the African elite learn from the mistakes of Afghanistan? This concludes our broadcast of Up Close and Center. I've been your host, Ebube Okoli. Please remember to like, share, subscribe, and hit that bell notification icon so that you'll be among the first to know every time new content becomes available. Additionally, if you have any further analysis, please feel free to use the comment section. Thank you for your time and your commitment to the continent.